Forgive me talking about Yeats, but it is St. Patrick's Day, and I thought I would indulge my childhood delight. And it's been fascinating hearing the other speakers talking about landscape, Christian imagination, history, childhood. And really that is, of course, where my relationship to W.B. Yeats stands. Yeats wrote 2 poems. He wrote many poems, obviously, but he wrote 2 poems about why it was a catastrophe to try and love somebody, because it might fail if you try method 1, which I'll do in a minute. And the method 2 works, but of course it means that you have to die in the process. And method 1 is his very, very famous, now iconic, in fact it's just been voted, I think, the greatest love poem of all time. I don't know who does these surveys, but it has. It's the most pure poem. It's the opposite of what Kirsty said about adjectives. It's got a lot of adjectives. It's nearly all adjectives. But it's a pure poem because the landscape of the poem is the landscape of the imagination. It's not the landscape of reality. And so romanticism and romance can live entirely in the aspiration. And as most of you will know, Yeats was obsessed with a woman called Maud Gonne. And when we were growing up, of course, we all identified like mad with Maud Gonne. We all wanted to be Maud Gonne. We wanted to grow up and look like Maud Gonne, have our hair, wear long skirts like Maud Gonne. In fact, just before I start talking about this poem, when I was very little, the thing we were taught at school, of course, by the nuns was that he never, ever got near Maud Gonne. I mean, he merely wrote poems to her. And I was walking along the high street in Cork one day, and we met a woman called Miss McCurtain, whose father had famously been the Lord Mayor of Cork and who had been shot by the Black and Tans. And Miss McCurtain said, "Come up to my house, I've got a lovely harp I can show you." We said, "A harp?" said my mother and I. She said, "Yes, a small harp that Yeats gave Maud Gonne when they had an affair in Paris." said my mother. We went up and we saw this lovely little tiny harp. Anyway, we had a lot of whiskey that afternoon. We had to do something to steady our nerves about the harp. So he didn't just write poems to Maud Gonne. I think Roy Foster's biography sort of tells us that. But the great, great poem, which I'm going to just charge through because most of you know it, is a sort of anthem now and probably overused, is the one what not to do, all right, to get your love. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread those cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. Well, whatever swooning that could cause, it didn't cause enough to get Maud Gonne to do any more than have a short affair. And he did say it was a catastrophe for him. But the other poem that he wrote is the first poem that I learned as an 11-year-old, in Cork. And it's a poem that I learned when I could still nearly see pixies and fairies. We thought we could see them, leprechauns. And then sort of with adolescence, you realize that maybe it was a blade of grass all along, or maybe something changes in your mind and your imagination is near the essence of all imagination, which is connected to landscape. You see lands when you're a child that you never see again as an adult. And I think it's these really non-intellectual, non-analytical places that we retreat to when we write books or read books or invent or create. And learning this poem opened up for me a sort of landscape in my head that made me think I knew Yeats, think I knew Maud Gonne, think I knew something about the eternal, possessive desires of love, when in fact I hadn't a clue. This morning, in order to have some fundament for this talk, I rang Roy Foster, Professor Foster, and said, "Roy, tell me something about this poem, Cap and Bells." He said, "Ah, yes, that's a famous castration poem." I said, I don't think the 11-year-old me was thinking in those terms. He said, of course, there's something very phallic about a cap and bells. I thought, is there? Aren't they sort of floppy? But it sort of reinforced my belief that poems don't just belong, of course, to the writer. They belong absolutely to the listener or the learner or the teller. And Yeats himself about this poem said, it's full of symbols, but the great thing about symbols is that they can be interpreted in different ways. And before I say any more about the poem, it's about a jester. And a jester is already a sort of medieval notion, and about him going towards this lady, but she doesn't really want him. And I think, again, the 11-year-old could understand that. And recently, when I was directing Onegin in the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, there's a most marvelous singer called Ronaldo Villason. And he is very passionate. And he played Lenski, who gets shot in the second act because he gets jealous about his girlfriend and causes a duel and gets shot at the age of about 20. I said, this is a very hard idea to get hold of. And Ronaldo said, no, it's not a hard idea. He said, when I was young, I wrote letters to a woman. She did not reply. I wrote again. I said, I'm going to kill myself. He said, all I wanted to do was to kill myself. And he said, I managed to get hold of a gun. So he said, I had the gun. He said, this is the amazing thing about adolescence. He said, I had the gun. I lifted the gun up. I had it in my mouth. I was pointing it. I was going to kill myself. And you know, he said, and my next thought was, I'm not going to kill myself. Still, I put it down, but I'd had the feeling. And then he said, recently he had met the lady, and he was with his wife of many years, and he said, remember I wrote you letters? She said, yes, I've kept them all. One of them survived. So this desire to, self-abnegate yourself, to kill yourself, was very much part, I think, of Yeats's thinking in this poem. What this 11-year-old was doing with it, I don't know. But I want to just say the poem to see if you can hear for yourself whether you think any of these things are true. What is the nature of creation? Does it always come out of a stillness, out of a death? Why is it that we bump into medieval imagination when we're trying to contact our own? Why is it that the world around us isn't always enough? We have to dip into the past like Kirsty looking for those roots of what goes on in those islands. We somehow, at that moment of 11, have no sense of Freud or Jung or castration, but we do sort of know something that we don't quite know. Anyway, here's the poem, and then we'll say something else about it at the end. The jester walked. Oh, I'm going to say one more thing, sorry. Yeats dreamt the poem. I think that's quite significant, that he used to write his dreams down. He was very interested in Jung and Freud, but people didn't really know that, but he wrote down the dreams. He dreamt this, so it has got a kind of mad narrative to it. The jester walked in the garden. The garden had fallen still. He bade his soul rise upward and stand on her windowsill. It rose in a pale blue garment when owls began to call. It had grown sweet-tongued from dreaming of a quiet and light footfall. But the young queen would not listen. She rose in her pale nightgown. She drew in the heavy casements and pulled the shutters down. He bade his heart go to her. When the owls called out no more, in a red and flickering garment, they sang to her through the door. They had grown wise-tongued by dreaming of a flutter of flower-like hair, but she picked up her fan from the table and waved it off in the air. I have cap and bells, he pondered. I will send them to her and die. And when the moment whitened, he left them where she went by. She laid them upon her bosom, under a cloud of her hair, and her sweet lips sang them a love song till stars grew out of the air. She opened her door and her window, and the heart and the soul came through. To her right hand came the red one, to her left hand came the blue. They set up a noise like crickets, a chattering, wise and sweet. and her hair was a folded flower, and the quiet of love in her feet. That's it. Have I got some more? I think it's astonishing because there's something about, you can see it. It's a bit like that castle of Kirsty's, actually. You sort of see it. And there she is. And I think now, because I had to think about this today, I didn't know why I like this poem so much. Why not the grander poems, the poems about disappointment or disillusion that would come with age? And it's something about it, it can't be named. And it's partially because English people speak in a G major chord. It's very, very sure. To be or not to be, that is the question. And Irish people speak on a minor chord. You know, to be or not to be, that is, well, maybe the question. And I think it's this actual lack of sureness about what it is that's being sought. No solution, just a sort of offering of what it might be at all, to create something, to not know its conclusion, to not know why you've said it, to not know as a child of 11 whether identified with the jester or whether identified with the lady who was waving her fan off in the air. And just some time ago, I had my head scanned by the Guardian newspaper, actually, but I went into a head scan to see what parts of my body, or my brain rather, were moving when I was speaking a poem. And it turned out, actually it was a bit of the wasteland, but it wasn't just the language bit of the brain that was speaking. Strangely, my arms were moving, even though I was lying in a scanner not moving. But most interesting, I think, the piece of the brain that deals with architecture was moving. So it does mean that language very quickly conflates into shape and into image and into a sort of wraparound 3 dimensions for all of us. And I think that's very, very useful. And finally, I just want to end with a little story that a man called Jean Calment told me, who's a lighting designer. He knew a Japanese dancer who was very, very old and told Jean about his mother, who was very, very, very old. And when she was dying, she lay in the hospital and she said in Japanese, "I am a flounder. I'm a flounder." So he sat there thinking, I don't know what my mother's saying, I'm a flounder, you know, what is this, flounder? And he's a dancer, so he went and began to try and dance this himself. And he lay down and he said, of course, as a flounder, the whole of the weight of the sea is on your back. And you can't move, and nothing happens, like at the beginning of a poem or the beginning of any act of creation. You don't know how to begin. But slowly you move the tendrils of your fins, or the very tips of them. Something moves, the muscle moves, something shifts through space. There's no answer to it, but the flounder could just move slowly through the water, and finally you're in an act of creation. Thank you.